Hello and welcome to the Alternative Leads lecture. Basically, what this lecture is going to do is just talk a little bit about the different lead types. We talked a little bit about the basic news lead. Well, we did a class on that and talked about some of those, where basically you're giving just the key information right up front, the critical information. But even that, I mean, the key is that there's probably about a million different ways you could lead a story. That every story, you could start with the people impacted. You could start with the policy change. You could start with, person A who's affected, person B who's affected. You could start by describing sights or sounds. You could start with quotes or questions or, talking directly to the reader. Or, you could start by talking about your journey through it. I mean, there's really a million ways you could write a story. There's a million ways you could lead a story. But typically, there's a few sort of tried and true ways that we do it. And so I kind of start off with that kind of as just a general point, is there are a lot of different ways you can lead a story. Now, as we go through this, we have the basic news lead, which we talked about previously. And the basic news lead is basically just this idea that, you're going to summarize the information. You might want to emphasize different things, but there are different types of basic news leads. I'm just going to kind of mention those. One thing to keep in mind is that, you can summarize the entire story in the lead. And that might be where instead of naming names or doing anything, you actually just tell us, what happened. You could name names, but you could also delay the identification of people, depending on what you want to emphasize. So basically, the whole point here of this is to say, there are different types of basic news leads, but the basic news leads can be ones where they're naming specific people, or maybe you're not naming the person because you want to emphasize the crime that was committed or the act that was taken. A man killed 14 people. You don't care who it was, you want to emphasize the killing. A generous person went out and helped 52 people by giving them $100 on the street yesterday, something like that. And then maybe you would delay identification of that person. Instead of saying Bill Smith did it, you would say, you would start with the delayed identification. But those are all still very basic, where you're giving the basic key information. Where we get into a different type, or alternative leads in a real form, is when we start getting into things where we aren't actually starting with the information. We're actually starting with basically telling a story or doing something else. So we start off with this anecdotal or narrative lead type. And an anecdotal or narrative lead is where instead of starting off and saying, maybe we'd have something about, well, let's just start off with saying like Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. Instead of starting off with a story about, Affordable Care Act has helped, 300,000 new people get insurance who previously couldn't be insured. That would be a basic news lead. But instead, maybe you'd start off with an anecdote. You'd find a person who, sorry about that, my computer was trying to tell me to update something. Maybe you would start off with a person who was needing to be, a person who was actually affected by the Affordable Care Act. Instead of starting off and telling us how many people and how it affects them, you would start off by telling us somebody who was. And so you would start off with their story, and you would say, Joe Smith had been suffering from diabetes for years. Because at times his health would become so bad, he had lost his previous job, or he had to leave his previous job, and yet had been unable to afford health insurance. As a result, every dollar he had went towards trying to supply it and going from free clinic to free clinic. And, you go on and on. You talk about that for a while. And instead of starting off by saying, but now there's a ray of hope in his life. He can get health insurance. And it can be all types of things. Maybe you could have something else. Talking about the Affordable Care Act. A person I know owns a business. And, you could start off and say, Bill, business owner, has suddenly been hit with what he considers a large tax. He had previously been paying $500 a month for his own personal health insurance that provided him with basic coverages, to having to switch to a $3,000 a month policy that has absolutely no benefit unless he has a catastrophic accident. And I know somebody who has a business and he's had similar issues where he's now has seen his insurance costs more than quadruple and unable to do it. And so instead of getting and telling us about how this affected or telling us just the real meat of it, you actually start off with a story. This is a very powerful lead type and one I highly encourage all of you to try, especially on your feature story. My reason is people tend to work off stories. People tend to relate to individuals. There's an idea within sort of postmodern and deconstruction, all this sort of newer literary theories, that stories tend to be the way we know things. But additionally, even like things like mythology, is an old style of, you teach people lessons about what's right and wrong, what they shouldn't be doing, by telling them stories about people who didn't do what they were supposed to be doing. Another example of the anecdotal lead is, another example of this is there's an old saying in journalism that, 1 death is a tragedy and 10 deaths is a statistic. That 100 deaths is a statistic, 1 death is a tragedy. And the reason is if you take something like 9/11, I think if people who were there at the time, it was just a horrific event. But for many of you now, I think that this class maybe has a little bit older students, people who are maybe mid-20s or older. Most of you probably have a pretty vivid memory of it. But for those of you who are younger, a lot of you were, 6 years old. You probably were not that actively aware. 5 years old. You weren't that old when this happened, and you may not even remember. But, you hear it and you go, well, 3,000 people were killed. Okay, that's a statistic. But if I start off and I tell you about, Sue City Lady who lived and worked in New York and had always dreamed and got a job and was on her first day and went down there and she was to be married next week and so suddenly you're getting this picture, and then her life is cut short and it's tragic, right? But if I just tell you 3,000 people were killed, you quickly just go, wow, 3,000 people, that's a lot of people, and you don't connect with anyone. But if I can get you to connect with that person, that is what's powerful. Is you then get that person and then you tell what happened. 3,000. She's among the 3,000 people who were killed. You have now connected with her narrative, with her anecdote, with her story, and you then lead into it. And so this is a popular way of doing it. I would say that most of the time when I was writing, if I could come up with a way to give an anecdotal or narrative lead, I tried to. I thought that they were very good. Your goal is somebody starts reading it, you find some way to connect, get it really interesting, really move in, get them enjoying the character, bump them with the information, run in through your information, come back and talk about them some more. Let the stories tell it. That's what you're out there doing. And you're trying to tell stories, you're trying to write about what people are doing. Another type is what's called a scene setter. Instead of focusing on a person, it focuses on what things look like, describing. This is where you use your skills as a person who can observe and describe. This is your chance to describe things. So instead of starting off with a lead in which somebody is actually, you're telling their story, instead you're starting off with what you see, what the scene is. And so, you can describe it in multiple ways. You can start off with sight. You could start off with saying, maybe after a tornado, row after row of house, paper strewn about. Maybe you would describe something. One way to do it is just describe things that really people would feel very personal about. Describe people's unmentionables being, in plain sight, or describe, a broken picture frame, or alone, miles away, a picture blowing across from that, or something. Whatever it would be, but you're describing it. You're really catching the vivid. And this doesn't have to be a tornado. It could be, I'm thinking like, my kids, we've sort of started the tradition now. They're old enough. They've been going for 2 years. So I guess it's a tradition. It's been 2 years, but we've taken them to like a Happy New Year event. They're common. And where you go and you do all the countdown to midnight at noon. And so, afterwards there's all these balloons and confetti and things. And so maybe you would describe that. You'd say, kids were screaming, the cheers were deafening, the ground was littered with paper. You couldn't even see the ground. People couldn't squeeze an inch out, and whatever it would be. I don't know. Where you're actually describing what's going on. But don't think that it has to be a sight. I want to sort of mention, it could be smell. You could say, you walk through the door of the restaurant and the overpowering, odor of cinnamon and yeast, wafts through the air and smacks you in the face, kind of thing. Where you're mixing in the smell or taste. Your teeth sink into the flaky, doughy exterior, and water rushes to your mouth, and you get something really great. Hold on, I gotta go eat something. No, just kidding. Sound. You can describe the sound. Whatever description, whatever scene you can set. The goal here is where you're actually describing what's going on. Now, it has to relate, and you have to be able to, when you get to the nut graph, you have to be able to the part where you kind of pull it back together. The idea with this is you may lead with a description, but you still need to get down to what we call a nut graph, which is this paragraph that gets to the meat of it. What is going on in the story in a nutshell. That's why we call it a nut graph, a nut paragraph. It's where the meat of the story or whatever. And so you're basically describing it for 2 or 3 paragraphs. It could be longer, and then you eventually get fairly early within a journalism, within a basic story, within 3 or 4 paragraphs. You're going to want to get to what's actually happening and why you're describing the scene. But that is what you're doing. And so I want to emphasize these alternative news leads. You kind of have to think that there still is a nut graph, but the nut graph is sort of the basic news lead that's buried a little bit lower below this other information. The blind lead, this is one where you withhold key information, maybe try to build some suspense, try to describe something without actually mentioning the thing that you have. And the reason is it kind of builds suspense. People are going, what are they talking about? Or, this is kind of a weird description. An example, I have one here. The most valuable consumer in the apparel business right now are people who carry no cash, have no credit cards, and often spit up dinner on their new clothes. Okay. Do you know what they're talking about there? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, there's the most powerful buyers in the apparel industry are people who don't have any money, no credit cards, and often spit up on their food, on their clothes. It's kind of leading, and then the next graph, the one that's probably more the nut graph, they're infants and toddlers. And at a time when sales in many apparel categories are flat, they're fueling a major boom in baby clothes. The idea here is, you're leaving off this key information. People read this and they're going, what are they talking about? And they're kind of hooked, and they're going, oh, this is interesting. They're also seeing something else that's another key important fact in your writing, is they're seeing a story that they're going to like reading. I mean, the case is if you read a story and it is boring from the start, there are some stories I've seen, they say stuff like I can just give examples recently, Governor Rauner has just come in when I'm making this video, and there are stories out there like, Rauner outlines his policy plan. Bruce Rauner gave a statement about what he hopes to accomplish. He hopes to see this occur, and this occur, and this occur. And the whole thing is going in, and it's just like, it's yawn from the beginning. And I'm reading it. Why? Well, I'm not reading it right then. I will be honest, I saw that story, or a couple stories like that in recent times. Read a few graphs and said, I don't think I can take it. And then a little bit later I said, you know what, I really should read that story. That is something that is very important to me. It's something that will impact my life. I need to read that story. And I went back and read it. But I read it by sheer willpower, not because I wanted to read it, because I felt like I should read it. And so the reason I say that is that was a writer who kind of let the reader down. They let them down because they didn't make the information interesting, didn't make it appealing. They had important information to give, but they didn't bother to read it. And so sometimes like a blind lead, having a little fun, doesn't just say, hey, this is important information, but it also says, I'm going to make this as accessible to you as possible. And if you can start off with something kind of fun and, maybe hide that information, and write it in a way that's compelling, you may actually be doing your reader a great service. I'm going to stop and continue in the next video.